Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your calling this hearing, and thank you for your steady leadership as we confront the problem of Iran's nuclear program. To our witnesses, thank you. Welcome. It's important that members hear views from across the spectrum as we play our part and weigh a potential deal. I've said from day one the devil is in the details, and until I know exactly what is in the deal, it's hard to comment on whether it deserves support or not. I have been troubled, as I've said many times, on the outset of these negotiations. Firstly, I have been very troubled that Iran was continued to allowed to enrich and spin centrifuges while we're talking. I think it would have been a heck of a lot better if Iran was told, if you want to have serious negotiations with us, while we talk, you stop enriching, but that wasn't done, and that's disappointing. I'm told that Iran wouldn't agree to it. Well, does that tell you something about their motives at the outset? I'm also disturbed that we're talking about Iran's nuclear capability. We're not talking about, as the Chairman pointed out, all the destructive roles they play around the world. The world's leading sponsor of terrorism. Somehow or other, we're not really talking about that in these negotiations. We've got four Americans in prison there. We had a hearing in this committee not long ago. I don't know, are they in limbo? What's the story? I think it's preposterous that our people are held hostage while we're negotiating with them. And the rhetoric still continues to come out. Syria, where hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed and maimed. The Iranians prop up the Assad regime, Hezbollah, Hamas, you name it, Yemen. They have played negative roles. And so it's very, very troubling. And again, the devil is in the details. I am glad that the reports are coming out, that the administration is digging in its heels. A lot of people said that they would cave at the last minute on some of these issues because they wanted to deal very badly. I think that's being shown that it's not the case, and that the Iranians are going to have to make some tough choices, or else we are prepared to walk away. I've said from day one that we couldn't want a deal more than the Iranians. If that's the case, then they will just, again, dig in their heels. And so they need to want a deal, and they need to be ready to make tough concessions. But the Chairman pointed out some of the troubling aspects of this. There are a few potential implications of a deal I'd like to touch on this morning. One of my serious concerns throughout this process is sanctions relief. Even if sanctions relief is gradual and conditioned on Iran's compliance with the deal, easing sanctions will eventually, as the Chairman said, translate into a major financial windfall for Iran's leaders. And let's think about what that means. Even with sanctions in place, Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Even with a crumbling economy, Iran spreads its destabilizing influence in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Gaza, and among our Gulf allies. Iran's leaders have said they'll use sanctions relief to help their people and shore up their economy. I'll believe it when I see it. So Congress will need to play a role here. The House has already passed legislation to curb funding to Hezbollah, which is wreaking havoc in Lebanon and helping Assad cling to power in Syria. I hope the Senate will act on this measure. And however sanctions relief plays out in the Iranian deal, Congress needs to make sure our sanctions against terrorist groups remain robust and effective. And that way, no matter what Iran chooses to do with its resources, we'll have other measures to keep funding out of terrorist hands. The other issue I'd like to address is how other countries across the region may respond to a deal. Iran as a nuclear threshold state would leave our ally Israel in a constant state of insecurity. Israel must always know that we will have their back. To deal with that challenge, we need to work with the Israelis, take a hard look at any outstanding concerns tied to this deal, and do whatever is necessary to ensure Israel's security. Likewise, for our friends in the Gulf, a nuclear arms race would create tremendous volatility in the region. Recently at Camp David, the administration heard from our Sunni Gulf allies about their concerns over Iran's behavior. This summit was a good start, but more needs to be done. I hope our witnesses can shed some light on what steps might help shore up stability in the region in the wake of a deal. But I think we also have to consider, and I want to raise a question I've asked again and again, if we don't get a deal, what are the alternatives? At this point, we all know the refrain, no deal is better than a bad deal. But let's see what the alternative would be. The alternative to a deal would surely mean some kind of military strikes on Iran's nuclear plans, and would also involve sanctions. I think when we weigh whatever final deal there is, we've got to weigh it with the alternative and see which alternative we like better. There are no good choices, but it's very, very troubling that Iran continues to do what it's been doing, and that we hear negative things from the Supreme Leader talking about all kinds of nonsense that we could not accept in any kind of a deal. So we need to consider where we will find ourselves if these negotiations fail. We cannot accept a bad deal, again, but we need to weigh the P5+1 proposal versus the alternatives. I look forward to hearing our witnesses' insights on these issues, and I thank them again for their testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel.
Thank all of you at the panel for good testimony. Look, I have a lot of difficulty with some of these deals, these negotiations, as you do. But I think that at this point, we're almost at the midnight hour, so to speak, we have to look at the choices that we have. And the way I see it right now, we have a choice to accept, Congress does, and support a deal that the administration negotiates, or we don't. And if we don't, then we need to look at the alternatives. I share all your concerns. There isn't anything that anybody said that I really disagree with. I think it's a problem. But I do think that the alternative, as I mentioned before, would simply be, as the Chairman and I have long felt, more sanctions on Iran, but also an attack on their nuclear plant. Now, if there's no deal, how long would the current sanctions regime hold? We are told, time and time again, that if there is no deal, and the perception is that the United States walked away, that the rest of the community, international community, would abandon the sanctions, even including our allies like the UK and France and countries that have been most supportive of us. So if we are unable to sustain the sanctions regime and have a bombing of their plant which sets them back 2 years or 3 years or whatever it is that really a viable alternative? Anybody who'd care to answer? Dr. Makovsky?
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Engel. I think when we think about the alternatives, again, as I mentioned, I think that we have to weigh. There's no good alternatives here, for sure. I just think that the alternatives, that this deal, the consequences of the deal are much worse than the consequences of no deal right now. And I would think about it in those terms. For instance, as I said, I think if there is I think one of the biggest problems with this deal is that there'll be that the other countries in the region will pursue nuclear weapons. The Saudis have said that. President Obama said it only in 2012. He said it with great certainty. And then I think you really have a problem. And then this problem is not just about Iran, but it's about the region. We don't really want the Saudis to get nuclear weapons. We don't want other countries to. And then the region becomes a lot more dangerous. So even if the alternative to this deal is a military action, I don't think it has to be right. It has to be. I think we could boost our leverage, as you indicated. But I think you could argue that even if there was a military strike, which we all hope it doesn't come to that, the consequences of that would be a lot less than what could be a nuclear contagion in the region and really a really serious conflict involving nuclear powers.
Well, the point I'm making is while we all find aspects of these negotiations that we don't like, and I've been saying mine for over a year, it's not just accepting this deal or nothing. There are things that we're going to have to come to grips with, and I believe one of them is bombing the nuclear reactor. The Europeans are seeking further economic ties with Iran. The Russians and Chinese are appearing to give up on the arms embargo and ballistic missile sanctions, as pointed out. Those are sanctions that are outside of the scope of the negotiations, clearly. So to me, it says about the viability of sanctions enforcement if a deal fails, we can see it eroding. Let me also make another point. We have a presidential election next year. You know, one of the things that's always pointed out is a new president is not necessarily bound by all the constraints of a deal that an administration negotiates. If the new president elected in 2016 feels that the Iranians are backtracking or not doing what they should be doing, then that president can move in a different direction. You know, one of the things that really disturbs me about this whole thing, and there are plenty of criticisms you can level at the administration or the president or the negotiations or whatever, but you know, I want to go back to 2007 because I think there's blame here on a bipartisan basis, quite frankly. In 2007, when President Bush was president, the national intelligence estimate on Iran told us that Iran had abandoned making weapons, and we all thought there'd be some kind of strike. You know, we're in this position right now because 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 6 years ago, 12 years ago, when we had the ability to really destroy Iran's nuclear capability, we didn't do it. And so we waited till 1 minute to 12, and now it's an impossible situation because they are almost at the breakout point. Why didn't we move sooner? Why didn't we move during the Bush administration when we thought they were going to do something? Why didn't we move when Iran wasn't spinning centrifuges, didn't have the sophisticated centrifuges? What do you think? I mean, I just think it shows a failure all the way around the political spectrum, not one party, everybody, that we failed to grasp the fact that this regime, the dangerous regime, poses a threat to us and our allies, and there's plenty of blame to go around all the way. So, Mr. Rademacher?
Congressman, I guess the principal observation I'd make in response to that last question is the military option didn't look any better in 2006 or 2007 than it does today.
Well, it looks better because they didn't have a sophisticated. They weren't as sophisticated. They didn't have all the centrifuges. It would have been easier to take out their nuclear capability way back when because it was a lot smaller.
Well, it's always been the same problem. You can destroy physical things that are on the ground, but you can't destroy technology. And they have the technology, they have the blueprint.
That's true, and that's always pointed out by the administration when they tell us, well, you can't destroy technology. But I'm saying it was a lot easier years ago when it was much smaller and easier to destroy than it is now. I mean, when Israel struck at Iraq, Iraq never recovered because their program was very, very small. The Iranian program was obviously much smaller 10 years ago, 6 years ago than it is now.
The ability to reconstitute was always there, and I think we could destroy what's on the ground today. But I mean, we understand that if we go down that road, we're going to have to come back every year or two.
I think their program is much more sophisticated in terms of being buried under mountains and things like that, and what wasn't necessarily the case 10 years ago. Dr. Dorian.
I was in the Bush White House in 2007, and I agree with you that there's blame to go around. But I'd like to share with you some of the thinking at the time, what we thought we were doing. We looked at it as a disaster if the President got to a point where he was faced with a stark choice of either bombing Iran or Iran getting a bomb. And we were trying to create a third option, which was, I'd say, coercive diplomacy. And it was with those thoughts in mind that we constructed, on the back of Stuart Levy's insights, the sanctions regime. And I think that strategy came to fruition in 2012, 2013, especially with the central bank sanctions, which really did start to bite, and you started to see very severe concern in Iran about this. And unfortunately, President Obama didn't have a coercive diplomacy approach to the question, and as Chairman Royce mentioned, when the regime was actually on the ropes, we let them up and made a massive concession to them in the form of a deal that included this sunset clause. And so we've sent the world, with the sunset clause, we've sent the world a message that we are no longer containing Iran, we're now managing its rise. And that has given rise to the rush that we see among the Europeans to go to prioritize their economic relations with Iran over the security concerns of the rest of us. That's actually been encouraged by the President's diplomacy.
Well, I've been, and I'm going to end, Mr. Chairman, because I'm way over. But look, I have been as critical as many of you about a lot of this stuff. But you know, we were told that the Bush administration would never leave office and allow Iran's capability, nuclear capability, to continue unfettered, and that's actually what happened. So I'm just pointing out plenty of blame to go around. I think this has been a failure, frankly, in American policy going back a couple of decades. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen.